Okay, so we are on Bays, Amud Bays. We are in 2b, and we move on to a new section of the Gemara. Yesterday, we spent considerable time trying to understand when and how and why there is the exception to the general rule with regard to the law of the Sotah. The general principle is that any matter must be established on the testimony of two witnesses. And we established that there are three elements, or three items that are going on with the Sotah that all require witnesses. Two in the positive, that is to say, two stages that are required in order to create the law of the Sotah, and one that would undo the law of the Sotah. And they are, number one is the husband warning his wife against secluding herself with a specific individual. That's one event. That event, all agree, must have two witnesses present in order to validate that event. Then the next stage is that she secludes herself with that person. Now here we run into a dispute. Rabbi Yeshua said that you require, which one said what? Rabbi Yeshua said, just pull up the last page. In the Mishnah. Rabbi Yeshua said you need to have two witnesses at the moment watching her seclude herself with this man. Whereas Rabbi Lezer said this point, this stage, where she secludes herself with this individual, only requires one witness to testify, or even he himself can testify that I saw the two of them seclude themselves. So those are the two positive events which create the law of the Sotah. The warning must have two witnesses, and then the seclusion dispute. Rabbi Yeshua says you need two witnesses. Rabbi Lezer says even one, or just he himself stating that he saw them seclude themselves. Event number three is, which would undo the law of the Sotah, is whether she was physical with this man. Because the entire premise of the law of the Sotah is that we are not sure what happened behind closed doors, and then the drinking of the water of the Sotah would reveal what happened. So if in the event that we know she was physical, then the law of the Sotah is off. She has to divorce anyway, and she has other laws because of infidelity, but the law of the Sotah is now off because we know she was physical. Now, how many witnesses do we need to tell us that she was physical in order to call off the Sotah? And yesterday we established, after a long pilpul, after a long back and forth, the last 2 days I should say, we established that only one witness is required to say, I saw the two of them being physical. And this is undisputed. Now we're zeroing in on the dispute between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Lezer, where Rabbi Yeshua is of the view that the event of the two of them secluding herself after the warning with two witnesses, the warning had two witnesses, everybody agrees. Then she secludes herself with this guy. Rabbi Yeshua says you require two witnesses to testify that they saw the two of them seclude themselves, whereas Rabbi Lezer says only one witness is enough to validate the law of the Sotah, and she would have to drink the water in the temple, etc. So we're zeroing in on this dispute. So the Gemara begins like this. After it quotes the Mishnah, Rabbi Yeshua says you must warn her, or she must be warned in the presence of two witnesses, etc. And you require two witnesses as well. In Rabbi Yeshua's view, you also need two witnesses who will testify that she secluded herself. So the Gemara says here, you can see my cursor, it's right there. My time with Rabbi Yeshua. What's the reason of Rabbi Yeshua that requires two witnesses, not just for the event of him warning her, but also for the event of her secluding herself with him? So Amakra, the verse says, getting back to the verse we've been talking about yesterday, which reads, Ve'ed ein ba, there is no testimony for that event. We established, that's the word we're highlighting, ba, that event, or in it. We established yesterday that the word aid, which we're translating not as witness, but rather as testimony, means two. So when the verse says there is no testimony, what we mean is there is no two witnesses, but there is one witness. So that's an exemption, or I should say an exception. The Torah is saying here, ve'ed ein ba, in this circumstance, there is an exception where one witness is acceptable. So therefore, Yeshua highlights the word ba and says, ba, in this scenario, there is the exception when you are allowed to rely on one witness and not wait for the two. But v'loy b'kinoi, ba v'loy b'stira. In it, in the event of her secluding herself, there is the exception that you can rely on one witness, but you cannot rely on this exception during the warning, the kinoi, ba v'loy b'stira, and you cannot rely on this exception when, I'm sorry, I misread, sorry. The verse as we established yesterday is talking about not their seclusion, but there is no testifying, there is nobody there, there is no testimony saying that they were physical, right? So the exception that you can rely on one witness is exclusively for the issue of their physical intimacy. But for every other part, you don't have this exception. And this is because of the word ba. Because the verse says the exception of relying on one witness, the aid ein ba, there is no testimony, meaning there is no two witnesses, but we do have one witness, ba, in this scenario of her being physical, that's what the exception. So in every other event, there's no exception. And therefore, even for warning, you require two witnesses, and even stira, even the fact that they have been secluded also requires two witnesses. Hope that was clear. Essentially,
that's Rabbi Yeshua's opinion.
Yes, this is Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, that the exception, this exception that we're allowing the event of her intimacy to be established by one witness, and thus undoing the Sotah. This is an exception to the rule where we're relying on one witness. Because the verse says ba in it, that means to say this is exclusively the only time when you have this exception. Every other event cannot rely on the exception. It must have two witnesses. And therefore, when you warn her, you have to have two witnesses. And also when she's secluded, you have to have two witnesses to testify that they were secluded. Because the only exception to rely on one witness is only in the event that somebody sees the two of them being physical. Okay, clear?
Yeah.
So the word ba in it makes it exclusive. This exception only applies ba in it, in this event of the two of them being physical. But every other event, the warning and the seclusion must have two witnesses and does not fall into this exception of relying on one witness. So this is Rabbi Yeshua's view, and that's why he requires two witnesses both for the warning and for the event that the two of them are secluded. But Rabbi Lezer said that for the event of his warning, you have to have two witnesses. But for the event of the two of them being secluded, Rabbi Lezer is of the view that one witness is enough, or even he himself can come along and say, I saw the two of them be secluded. So how does he come to this conclusion? So the Gemara says like this, but the Torah says that there's an exception in this event of their physical intimacy. There's an exception that we allow one witness, but this word ba, which says that exclusively in this event, we allow this exception that we rely on one witness, is not to exclude every other scenario. It's only to exclude one other scenario, right? Because there are three events, as we described before, there are three events that are transpiring. There is the warning, there's the seclusion, and there's the physical intimacy. With the physical intimacy, the Torah says explicitly, we're relying on the exception that you can rely on one witness. Okay, that's down. But then the verse over here, with that third event of their intimacy, the verse says, this exclusively is where you have the exception, you're allowed to have one witness. So exclusively this and not what? So Yeshua says to the exclusion of all other events, and therefore both of the other events require two witnesses, because only this one gets the exception. Rabbi Lezer says it's exclusive to this, but not exclusive to this in the sense that no other, but it's exclusive to this. It's coming to exclude only one other scenario from this exemption, meaning to say only one of the other two require two witnesses. So which of the two, right? Which of the two am I saying is part of the exemption, and which of the two is not part of the exemption? That's somewhat clear?
Yeah, it would be 2 and 3. Then.
Yeah, so which one of the two? Is it the seclusion that requires two, or is it the warning that requires two? Because if Rabbi Lezer's understanding that when the verse says the aid ein ba, that the ba in it, that with the event of their intimacy, you have the exemption that you can only rely, that you're allowed to rely on one witness and not two, and that doesn't exclude every other scenario. It only excludes one other scenario.
It would be one.
It would be one of the two. So which one of those two do you have? So therefore, he says, in it, in the case of their intimacy, you can have the exemption of only one witness, but not when you're warning her. And therefore, with the case of their seclusion, you can rely on one witness. But the Gemara asks, why are you choosing one over the other? Why not say that when the verse said that if you're excluding one of the two from the exemption, why not exclude the seclusion from the exemption and say that seclusion requires two, whereas warning requires one? Why are you choosing one over the other? So in Rabbi Yeshua, it all makes sense. The verse says exclusively this is exempt. This is the one you're allowed to rely on one witness. Every other thing is only two. But for Rabbi Lezer, who's saying that, okay, the event of their intimacy, we rely on one witness. Okay? And then you can choose which of the other two events does require one witness and which of the other two events requires two witnesses. So why are you choosing the warning to be the moment when you require two over the moment of the seclusion for when you require two? Why is one better than the other? So it says the Gemara, first the Gemara tries to use scriptural analysis, and then later it's going to go with logical analysis. So let's begin with the scriptural. The Gemara says the event of their seclusion is put in the Torah directly connected to the event of their intimacy. The Eksiv, as the verse reads, in the context of the laws, the verse uses the words, and she secluded herself and she became intimate. Okay, so you see, in some context, the Torah puts the two together. So if that's the case, the same law that applies to her intimacy, namely, only one witness is required, the same thing is true of their seclusion. Only one witness is required because the verse puts the two together. But the Gemara counters and says, if you're talking about scriptural relation, that the Torah puts the two things together, there's another verse in which the warning is also put together with the event of their intimacy. As the verse reads, he warned his wife, she became intimate. So the event of intimacy, which is where this exemption exists, that you're allowed to rely on one witness, is associated scripturally with both other events, with the event of warning and with the event of their seclusion. So why choose one over the other to say that the warning requires two and is not part of the exemption, whereas the seclusion doesn't require two and is part of the exemption? If the two of them are both associated with intimacy in scripture, why choose one over the other?
Yeah, it's a wash.
It's a wash, exactly. So says the Gemara, but Hamir Rahmana, but we have to choose one because the Torah says that the exemption for one witness is in the event of her intimacy. And when the Torah uses the word in it, it means this one and not another. So you have to exclude one from the exemption. Now, Mara Isa, why are you choosing one over the other? Right, because like you said, it's a wash. The Torah associates both events, the witness, the seclusion and the warning in two separate verses. The Gemara, the scripture associates it with the moment of intimacy. And if intimacy has the exemption, there's no reason to apply that exemption to one over the other. So Mari Isa, why are you choosing one over the other? So now the Gemara is going to go with logic, since scripture is a wash, because you have the association with both. Says the Gemara Mistabra, it makes more sense that stira difa, that seclusion is more tightly connected to the event of intimacy, and therefore the moment of seclusion will get the exemption that intimacy gets. Exemption of intimacy that we're allowed to rely on one witness, and because seclusion is more tightly connected to the intimacy, therefore that exemption will also apply to the seclusion. Why are they most closely related? The moment of intimacy would make her forbidden to her husband. That's the law. If she's infidelity, she's forbidden to be with her husband under these circumstances. Now, if she was secluded, and we don't know what happened behind closed doors, she also is forbidden to be with her husband. Because at that moment, we're not sure if she was intimate or not. And we have to wait for the drinking of the water to find out whether she was indeed faithful or not. So because both of these events the moment of intimacy and the moment of seclusion, because both of those events make her forbidden to be intimate with her own husband. They both have those shared laws, therefore they're most closely related. Even though the reason why she's forbidden by intimacy is out of certainty, we know she was intimate. And the reason why she is forbidden to her husband in seclusion is because of a doubt. We're not sure what happened. But in either event, the law remains the same. She's forbidden to be intimate with her husband. By the way, she's also forbidden to be intimate with the person with which she secluded herself. Meaning, if they later on divorced, she couldn't then go marry the person she was secluded with. She becomes forbidden to both of them, just by the way. But the point here is that the Gemara is suggesting that the reason why the exemption for the event of intimacy, where the exemption is, we can rely on one witness. The reason why that exemption is extended to the moment of seclusion rather than extended to the moment of warning is because the two are most closely related. Because the law, at the end of the day, for both of these events are the same. The law post intimacy is she can't be with her husband, and the law post seclusion is she can't be with her husband, even though one is out of a certainty because we know she was intimate, and the other is out of doubt. We don't know if she was intimate. But either way, she's forbidden after that event, and therefore the most closely related. Now the Gemara says, Adrabah. The Gemara counters and says, all the way on the contrary. I can give you some reason why the warning is more associated with intimacy and more associated with the state of her being forbidden. Because Kinoi Adiv, warning is more integral here. Shekain Iker Garamla. Because it's the primary event that causes this whole thing to happen. Without him warning her, the whole cycle thing doesn't begin. She can seclude herself with other people, even though she shouldn't, for reasons of modesty. But in theory, if she secluded herself with people without him warning her, nothing happened. So if you're trying to make a more closely related link between her being forbidden to her husband as a result of some event, and that's why we're saying that's the event would get the exemption, just like intimacy, because intimacy also forbids her to her husband, then why not go with the moment of warning? Because that's what began the whole process. The whole validity of her as a Sotah is because of the warning. So if we're going to extend the exemption to anything, extend it to the primary event. So we're stuck in the middle here. And if the Gemara says like this, Ilav stira, if they weren't secluded, kinu me'ika, if they weren't secluded, is the warning of any value? No, because he warned her, no seclusion, life goes on. Vilav kinui, and if there was no warning, stira mayahani, then her seclusion, what has been accomplished? So again, it's a wash. All these stages are equally integral for the final law. So you can't choose one over the other. So from scripture, it's a wash because the verse associates intimacy with both of these events, the warning and the seclusion. And logically, it also is a wash because both of these events are equally integral for the law. So the Torah provides us with an exemption for the moment of intimacy that we can rely on one witness rather than the usual two. And we have the ability to extend that exemption to one other event. Why choose one over the other? They're both equally integral to the event, and they're both equally associated in Scripture. So we have to find some other reason why, in the Rishua's view, the exemption of one witness, the allowance for one witness at the moment of intimacy, why that exemption is extended to the moment of seclusion rather than to the moment of warning. Okay, so we're going to give the answer and we'll conclude here. But the Gemara tomorrow is going to go through this exercise again, but then it's going to come to a bit of a different conclusion, which is going to add more logic a little bit to this whole thing. But at the moment, the Gemara's logic is as follows: Afilu halchi, nonetheless, even though it's a wash, and they both have equal association scripturally, and they both have equal logic because they're both equally integral to the process. Stira adifa. It's better to associate the moment of seclusion to the intimacy rather than the moment of warning to the intimacy, because the moment of seclusion is already the beginning of their intimacy. In other words, like this: even though it's true that from a legal perspective, the seclusion is of no value, or the seclusion is of no legal consequence if there is no warning. That's true. Legally speaking and scripturally speaking, the moment of warning and the moment of seclusion have the same value because they're both equally important for the law of the Sotah. And therefore, from that perspective, there's no reason to associate one over the other more or less to the exemption that's provided for the moment of intimacy. But in terms of the reality on the ground, seclusion is much more directly linked to the act of intimacy. That's the first step. The first step in the physical act of intimacy is the two of them sneak off somewhere. And because in the physical part of it, the seclusion is literally the beginning of the process of their intimacy, therefore the exemption of intimacy definitely extends to their seclusion, because it's like one long story. We're dividing it into two, seclusion and intimacy, because the Torah divides it into two, because there is the scenario of seclusion when it may or may not lead to intimacy. And that's why we're separating them, because there's a seclusion and we don't know what happened afterwards, and therefore there's the law of the Sotah. But in terms of the reality on the ground of people being unfaithful, the first step is seclusion. The first step in any intimacies, whether it's kosher or not kosher intimacy, the first step is the two go off together. And because in the reality on the ground, the seclusion is more tightly connected to the moment of intimacy, therefore it's more logical, says the Gemara, to extend the exemption that's applied to intimacy, that we rely on one witness, extend that exemption to the event that directly leads to it, the seclusion. Whereas the warning must be done by two witnesses. Tomorrow, God willing, the Gemara is going to introduce another Mishnaic age text that has this statement of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, but that Mishnaic age text has a somewhat different formulation. And because it is a different formulation, the Gemara is going to go through a similar exercise as we did today, but going to add details which are going to give us much more grounded logic into this whole into the whole law of the Sotah. And then after that,
Rabbi,
yeah.
With regard to, for example, because of those two elements, with regard to the chronology of what could happen,
Yeah.
Isn't it in a way an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure?
How do you mean?
From the point of view, because of the fact that you're weighing everything to ensure that there is a awareness and an establishment in the mind that will prevent such matters. So it's basically a teaching element also to ensure that there's an ounce of prevention rather than the pound of cure that might come later.
I see. So from that sense, actually, it would. I think what you're saying is actually going to match the Gemara tomorrow. Say something to the effect of post factum, which one's easier to lie about? And we want to prevent that.
You want to prevent, exactly.
So if we were to give allowances to the husband to say, oh, I warned her, or the husband to say, oh, I saw them seclude themselves, which one would he more easily lie about? And then how do we make sure to prevent that by having two witnesses there? And
Indeed.
that's what we're going to get into tomorrow. So I think what you're saying is actually the logic that Gemara is going to apply in tomorrow's formulation.
I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
God bless you all. Have a wonderful day. Yeshikoach, dear Rabbi. Thank you.
Pleasure as always. Have a wonderful day, buddy.
You too. All the best.